Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Integrating Learning Experience into Business. My name is Melissa, and I will be kicking things off for us today. Let's get started with some brief introductions. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, who is the Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group, and Alan Partridge, PhD, who is the Director of Digital Learning Evangelism at Adobe Digital Learning Solutions. As I mentioned, Alan is the Director of Digital Learning Evangelism at Adobe Digital Learning Solutions and has 20 years of experience in e-learning, education, games, and multimedia development. He has researched and reported on authentic educational solutions for audiences around the world for the past decade. Alan is recognized for his many online video tutorials and e-seminars, which are a mainstay for e-learning developers and trainers learning to create effective online educational materials. I would like to extend a thank you to Adobe for sponsoring today's webinar. Adobe Learning Manager, a cloud-based learning platform that delivers engaging learning experiences at scale for customers, partners, and employees. Drive customer retention, boost sales performance, and bridge knowledge gaps by delivering brand-aware and personalized learning experiences. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that we currently have several certification programs open for enrollment, including our Certified Learning Strategist program, and you can visit certification.brandonhall.com for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research, so if you have a few minutes to spare and see any topics on our schedule that you'd like to take a survey for, it's always greatly appreciated. The links will be available in your handout, and you can always visit brandonhall.com and click on Open Surveys for the latest list. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And last but certainly not least, a few logistics. To ask questions today, we ask that you please use the questions panel on your control bar. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we will share a link to the recording and a PDF of today's presentation via email in roughly 24 hours. If you would like to download a copy of today's presentation instantly, the link to do so will be available in the chat momentarily. And lastly, the chat is open for today. So we invite you to join in on today's discussion. Please share your thoughts as we go through, or just simply pop in, say hello, and let us know where you're joining in from today. And without any further delay, I'll turn it over to Dave so we can dive right in.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We've got a really great opportunity here today to have Alan with us to share his insights and knowledge with the group. So I highly recommend you take advantage of that question box or the chat and ask us some questions, get involved in the discussion that Alan and I are going to have. I think, my role here is to sort of use Brandon Hall Group's research into sort of learning and the business and the learning experience to bring up some real key elements of this. And then we'll sort of talk around what that means for organizations and what some of the things that companies can start to think about doing to move in this direction. So we'll get into a little bit of how L&D is changing, and that evolution has obviously accelerated quite a bit over the last couple of years. We're going to get into a little bit more specifics around the ideas around neuroscience and cognitive principles within learning as it comes to making that connection between learning and what people are doing for the business. And then we'll also look at some of the learning technologies that are in play, some of the things to think about from a tool perspective that can help make all of this stuff happen. And then we'll sort of wrap it up. And, as Q&A at the end, of course, we'll save a little bit of time and do that. But please ask questions throughout. We're going to keep an eye on those, and we'd love to be able to, have that dialogue with you as we go. So without much more, Alan, I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about the evolution of L&D. And I think this is something that came out of one of our more recent studies that really has stuck with me since I started to see the results. We asked two separate questions, which I think are interesting when looked at together. The first one is actually on the right, this idea that how important does the organization believe that L&D is to the success of the business, right? In order for that business to be successful, how big of a role does learning and development play? And you can see that you've got about 62% of organizations say give it a 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale. So that would be very important or critical to the success of the business. So clearly there is a recognition of this important role that L&D plays in the overall success of an organization in achieving their goals. But then when you look at the stat on the right, and again, 5-point scale, we asked the L&D teams, your approach to learning, whatever it may be, do you believe that it's positioning you well to develop the skills that the business is going to need for the future of work? And the results are not so great, right? I mean, the biggest group is in that 3 category, 44%, and only 37% give themselves a 4 or 5. And, Alan, I don't know about you, but if I see an organization give themselves a 3 on a question like this, right, on a scale of 5, are you well positioned? I would take that to say you're probably not very well positioned.
Yeah, I think that's a fair bet. And I'm thinking about this data almost from a sort of memory-based longitudinal question, and I recall seeing similar data in the past, and it seems like there's a growing awareness. Is that the sense that you have, that the organizations are definitely more and more aware, which it kind of jives with the reality that we've come to recognize that it's a lot more expensive to upskill our personnel, but it's even more expensive to try to replace people or bring in new people to fill those roles. And the fact that L&D organizations are clearly feeling like they're not able to meet the need of the hour is disconcerting, right? That on the whole, we're not quite there. I'll be curious to see. I'm data hungry today, so I'm curious to see if you have other numbers that suggest, maybe dig into this a little bit and try to understand why L&D groups are feeling this way.
Yeah, well, that's right. We'll do that. And I think what's interesting to me is you asked, is this something longitudinally, has it changed? And it definitely has. Like if you had asked learning leaders, of course, they've always known that learning is very important to the business. But yes, the business leaders maybe I'm not so sure. And I think the pandemic did a lot to recognize what role L&D plays in making sure people have the right skills they need to do what they need to do. And it's almost one of those moments where it's like the dog has finally caught the car. Right. So learning has always been trying to prove to the business that we are very important. What we do is so critical to the business. Now the business is saying, you're right, we're going to lean on you heavily to get us to this next stage. And then learning realizes, oh, but we're not really that great at doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a time of many things, right? I mean, because if you recall, before we were worried about the pandemic, we were worried about the mass retirements that were pending. As the boomers met their logical retirement dates. Then the pandemic added to and complicated that, and not just by the fact that people sort of discovered that maybe they didn't or weren't aligned to the work that they were doing, and maybe reevaluated, even retrained independently, but also the fact that people sort of reexamined their economic base and said, do we need a 2-income home? Can we live with a 1-income home? Can we scale back? And so we ended up with these large-scale mass retirements that I think only were complicated by the ones that were already coming down the pipe. And so suddenly workers became more valuable by the fact that they were harder to locate.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the key, is that these challenges that we're facing, that you're not going to hire your way out of these challenges or through them. And so we asked we're curious, what is it that is getting in the way? What are organizations facing from an L&D standpoint? What are some of the challenges? Why do they feel as though their approach isn't working, isn't meeting their needs? And the biggest reason, and you could ask this question probably almost any moment in time and get a similar response, right? The number one thing is going to be, well, we just don't have the people, the time, the resources to do this. And that's totally understandable. And I think that's true, and maybe even slightly more true now in the wake of a pandemic and all the economic upheaval that's followed. But the reality is, it's almost never not been the case, right? And I can't imagine a time when I would have asked a learning leader, do you wish you had more time? Do you wish you had more money? Do you wish you had more people? And I don't think anyone's ever said no. So the reality is, this is just how things operate. Is yes, we would love to have more resources. We don't. So how do we do what we need to do with what we have? So once you acknowledge that as the first challenge, but then you sort of have to accept the reality of that and then say, okay, and then what do? You can't just say, well, we can't do these things because we don't have
Yeah.
time, money, or people, because those things may never come, or at least not come in the volume, that you would need. So once you get that out of the way, then some of the challenges, especially around building skills, like making the organization more effective in the future, able to meet future challenges and needs, it becomes the fact that L&D teams, well, they haven't really identified the future skills gaps. They don't know what the
Right.
gaps will be. And that's partly because they don't really know what skills they're supposed to have right now.
Yeah.
And then, so let alone what kind of skills do you think we're going to need in the future? And look, no one's saying, well, you have to be able to predict the future and you have to know exactly what skills you're going to need 12 months from now, 24 months from now. But instead it's, well, you have to start thinking that those things may change and you have to have a system in place that can help build those skills when it becomes readily apparent what they are, right? It's being able to be reactive, be able to adapt, be able to adjust, as opposed to just literally defining every single skill and competency you think you may need. But you can see all these things sort of line up around that. And then just, okay, well, we need a technology system that's going to help us execute on the things that we're trying to do. A lot of organizations feel as though their current technology ecosystem isn't up to the task. They also don't feel like the content that they have is mapping properly to the needs of the business or the skills that they need. And so there's a lot of challenges going on here.
Yeah, I mean, this triggers several thoughts here, Dave, because I think that one is thinking about Brown et al. And the half-life of skills, so that we know that out of the base, the notion of a skill and the competency in that skill is of a limited time frame, and we're not even sure in most cases what the duration or the lifespan of that skill is going to be, depending on where it's come from and what our training materials are and how quickly that space is evolving. But also it makes me think of all the deep conversations I've had with L&D leaders who've gone through these exercises and tried to really deeply understand and define the skills across their organization, to bring them together into common pools, to try and address this problem. And what they all tell me is, at best, that comprehensive analysis resulted in 2 years of feeling relatively stable in terms of satisfying the needs of the organization for the skills, but then it was gone. And the exercise itself generally takes a year to a year and a half. So there's this sort of feeling of frustration and never-ending wheel that happens for people. And then the last one is, I wonder if you think, I've noticed a lot of organizations have been shifting away from a skill-centric model into a competency-based one. Do you think that shift into the competency-based space is something that's being driven by the frustration around skills and the ability to define based on those skills?
I would say so, for sure. And in fact, I'm going to jump ahead to something that we're going to share in a minute, but I think it lands on what you're talking about. And actually, something that was mentioned by Marino in the chat about, not Marino, it was Robert's comment about, yes, you can teach the skills, but what about after the training? And we're going to delve into that a little bit here in a minute. But looking at the bigger challenge that learning is facing, right? We've looked at these challenges around skills and what the L&D teams are facing, but then the reality is this recognition that organizations are looking for these bigger, more critical skills. Maybe in the past have been called soft skills, which is a terrible name for them, and it doesn't support what they're really all about. But this recognition that this is not just for leadership, which is what it used to be. These kinds of things were purely the realm of leadership development. Organizations are realizing, hey, it actually makes sense that if up and down and across the organization, we're helping to develop these kinds of competencies, these kinds of capabilities, so that when it comes to new specific skills, new challenges that come up, we're better able, everybody throughout the organization is better able to adapt and adjust. Plus, it also helps build our leadership pipeline moving forward, because these are such desirable leadership qualities. But the idea of learning agility, helping people learn how to learn, because we know as we try to upskill and reskill to adapt to the changes that are happening, we need people to be able to take in new knowledge and execute on it relatively quickly. So how do we help people learn more quickly, learn new different things in a different way? Then about thinking things through from a standpoint, design thinking, helping build emotional intelligence. These are things that in the past may have been looked at as, well, these are things you hire for, right? You have to find people who look like this, and that's what you go by. But the reality is these are the kinds of things that can be developed. Yes, obviously some people have some of these things more innately than others, but they can be developed and they can be grown. And so while this is great, and I think it's very promising for the future of organizations, it presents a big challenge for L&D, because these are not the kind of skills where you create an hour-long e-learning course and say, here, take
Right.
this emotional intelligence course, and as long as you get an 85% on the assessment, you're emotionally intelligent. It's much more deeply involved in that. It requires much longer term development. So I think that's one of the interesting things that are coming up.
Yeah, I think this one is fascinating, especially the emotional intelligence that, when I studied a long time ago in my education work, um, oftentimes my perception was that we were basically being told, avoid the affective domain. That we ultimately didn't understand how to evaluate it or assess it effectively. So just set it aside and focus just on the cognitive, that which can be demonstrated tangibly and that's based on facts and information. And I think that there's such a loss there, and it's something that hasn't really been developed as extensively as it could be. But I am seeing change. For example, at the most recent Adobe Learning Summit, in lieu of several presentations that we would typically have had during an afternoon, we actually had a design thinking workshop, which brought people together to kind of go through these design thinking steps and work through problems and do it in teams and have those collaborative experiences. There is unquestionably a need to escalate these elements, because whenever you speak with someone who's hiring in the professional business world or someone who's working with others in a leadership role, these are the things that they'll tell you are needed. They're the areas that they'll tell you are seriously important or critical to their business needs. And yet they're the ones that I think we have the least experience kind of figuring out, how do we teach these things? How do we effectively make them move forward? And if you think about even the technology that supports this sort of remote access that's at the core of a lot of these learning encounters, that technology does not generally lend itself well to communicating in these kind of ways, the ways that align to this sort of these areas, these skills.
Yeah. The traditional sort of static learning experiences that we're so accustomed to are not really built for this. And what we're seeing at first in this sort of awkward transition phase, even post-pandemic, when it blew up all the in-person instructor-led training and people had to think about new ways to do it, as things have settled and we're coming back to doing things live and in person, we're seeing this move to, okay, let's take this new thinking about skills, capabilities, competencies, the things that the business needs. Let's take those and we're going to shove that into our old frameworks and our old models.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work. We have to take
Yeah.
these new concepts and these new skills and build frameworks and processes and technologies around that.
Yeah, and Robert and Larissa are echoing that in the chat. So Robert mentioned specifically that these capabilities require a change in culture, so a completely different approach. And Larissa mentions that we have to get away from that kind of passive learning experience where learners are regarded as something that can consume information, into a more interactive and collaborative kind of experience to deal with these higher level objectives. And I think that's by and large true. I think, sometimes we get on a high horse and say, oh, no, it always has to be sage on the stage, or is it guide on the side? Well, I don't know that we have to either or flip that for all elements of learning, but certainly there seems to be a need to have a more immersive experience when it comes to these specific skills.
Yep. Yeah. And that sort of brings us into this sort of more pointed area that we want to talk about, because this approach it has to take into consideration these sort of principles. And we're not saying that everybody, in order to be successful, has to become a neuroscientist, but there has to be a basic understanding of neuroscience principles, cognitive principles, how people learn, what works, in order for you to start apply these things. And one of the things you said, Alan, it always comes to me for what I do for my work, and as I write, and I'm always referring to people, we refer to them as learners, right? It's like, oh, how many learners, or what do learners need? It's easy, it's shorthand, you know what I mean when I'm talking about it. Really conceptually, I'm starting to get to this point where I feel like we shouldn't be calling people learners, because what you're doing is you're now separating them. When you're doing your job, you're this. When I have you, you're a learner, which means it's something different.
Right.
And the truth is, as people, as humans, we are by definition learners. And so I think we don't have to be so reductive. The idea is, as L&D professionals, as the learning function, as whatever it is, all we're trying to do is help you be a better whatever it is you are. Whether that's an employee, a performer, a contributor, whatever you want to call yourself, but you don't have to be separated out as this learner to do that. It has to all be one and the same. And so that gets into this idea around, like I said, we're not going to be able to do a dissertation on cognitive learning here in this time, but it's just really about the more effective use of the brain, right? And it's gaining knowledge and understanding through senses, experience, and thought. So it's more than just, I read this thing, I watched this thing. I have to have some sort of experience that connects the dots for me, whatever those dots are for me, right? And we know that everyone's an individual now, and we try to do as a good a job as we can is making the experience adaptive enough so that for every person it's meeting those particular needs. But it's, and again, back to Robert's earlier comment about encouraging learners to reflect on the material, how to apply it. Like, okay, now I know this, how would I do, why does that matter? How would I use that in what I'm doing? And then really helping improve those problem solving skills, which again, cascades through all the other things that we want people to be able to do. It's going to make them more able to do those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we see it all the time. Taking that active step with the information, and it kind of seals it in for most people. And I love that notion that we should consider who the audience is and talking to them as themselves, and avoid these kind of terms and language that maybe it kind of lumps them and separates them in our mind. Yeah, it's a great idea.
And so just a little bit more on these principles though, but the idea of, again, going back to that learning how to learn, right? So learning how to properly take into the information that you need and then apply it to the problems, and then being able to change your approach based on your needs in the moment. And this is the kind of thing that really drives that working memory. So, you talk about the idea of the forgetting curve, whether you buy into that or not. There's arguments for and against, but still, at its core, it's true that there's no way someone's going to remember every single thing that they took in a formal event a few days later, a week later, a month later. They're not. But if you're presenting things in a way that give them space, give them time to reflect, seeds it into that working memory, when they need that information, that knowledge, that ability, it's going to be able to be called upon. And then we found, there's a big focus on personalization of learning, making it more contextual. I mentioned it a second ago. So there's a lot of different elements to that. Specifically, this idea of these science-based principles, that spaced learning helps learners internalize, right? Make the learning real for them. This is what it means to me in my life, in my daily work. And so that's a really important part of personalization. And of course, the ability to practice and reinforce just makes the learning real. It brings it to life. So it actually is a real thing. And we've seen in our studies, those organizations say that their approach is making them ready for the future of work. 80% of them focus on these principles. They say, yes, these are very, very important or critical to our learning approach, whereas only 65% of the organizations say that they're not prepared, say the same. But if you look at it, even those that are not prepared yet, this is obviously not the only reason they're prepared or not prepared, but there's a recognition that these things are important across the board.
This is it's excellent. And I love this sort of, in my mind, I'm categorizing this and thinking of this as reinforcement and application, reinforcement and application. You know, what I don't see here that I'm kind of finding myself thinking about is that when I'm learning, I also want to understand the why, right? Why is this way?
Mhm.
Why does it function this way? What's behind it's almost like I want to form a meta narrative around new ideas and information in order to understand better where those fit into my world. So I don't know what I'm doing there. Am I aligning to a pre-existing schema? Am I is there some limit in my available brain tree that makes me feel like I need to know why? But I know that that's the only thing from that series that feels absent to me.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, in fact, let me put this up and we're going to talk about it because I think you're not doing something odd or wrong or different. In fact, I think I would argue everybody has that same thought to some degree or another. For a lot of people, it might be completely subconscious, right? They're not giving it as much um, direct thought that you might be like saying, "Oh, I really want to know why," and I'm going to. They may subconsciously though just want they have that in them. I want to know why. They may not address it, they may not follow through on it, but I think for the most part, everybody has that. And that's where we get into this idea of personalized learning. This idea of we have to get comfortable with the phrase, what's in it for me? We have to take all the negativity out of how that phrase may have been used in the past, and recognize that it's a really important thing for people. Everybody's busy, everybody's trying to contribute. And so as learning professionals, we're asking of their time, energy, and attention. Well,
Right.
they want what's in it for me. Why? If you give me that, I will do what I need to do. Right. So it's this threshold that companies need to cross when you think about, say, learner engagement. Like, oh, how do we engage learners? Well, we'll make a really cool video and we'll have all the colors match in the right palette and the buttons will be in the right place. Yeah, that's all very good and important, but that's not really learner engagement. If you're telling somebody, hey, this is important to you because this is your job that you do, it's going to help you do it better, it's going to help your teammates, it's going to help the organization because of X, Y, and Z. Before they even open a piece of content, before they read a word, watch a second of a video, they're already sort of bought in. They get the why, they get the, okay, if I do this, this should happen. So now you're already at this level of engagement where all the other stuff is going to just make it that much better. I think that's what's important.
Yeah.
So, we looked at some of the things around personalization, and again, there's a million things to dig into from there, but just for now, that we do know that most organizations are trying to work on this, make it so that the learning that people are experiencing is relevant to them based on their experience, based on their path, based on their strengths and weaknesses, as well as it's available to them in a time and a format that makes the most sense for them, right? It's the two-pronged approach where the content itself is relevant, and then the media, the way in which they access it, is also relevant to them.
Nice. And just to let you know, David, there are several comments in the chat that sort of echo those ideas. Several people have mentioned this sort of direct connection, an interesting connection from Leslie, who said that that's a mechanism that helps me move it from short-term memory to long-term memory, which kind of makes sense to me, right? That's part of my storage system. I think that also Sabrina says I might not remember the how, but if I know the why, I'm already on the right path. And I know that's sort of abstractly how I feel about that as well. That's one of the reasons that I love getting to talk with Dave is because he thinks about these things very analytically and grounds them all in solid data, which is incredibly valuable. And one of the limitations that I have is that I tend to think of these things in a more abstract sense, more about my personal application, that sort of thing. So it's amazing to get to hear this data and to have you here to kind of help bring it around so that I understand, how the data is aligning or not aligning with what the processes are that I'm using. And then when I see that something's not aligning, I kind of want to drill on that, right? And pick at it and see, oh, is there something new I can learn? Can I find a new way or a new approach based on what the data is showing? Yeah, this is great stuff, Dave. Oh, did I lose you, David?
Yep, Alan, he messaged me. He will
Oh,
be right back. He lost connection, so I
okay,
apologize for
no
that, folks.
worries. No worries. Well, just a shout out to those of you in the chat who are participating. Thanks so much. It's great to have your comments. I always say that the most important people in the room for any one of these sessions are actually all of the attendees. If we put together the experience base of everyone who attends, we'd quickly realize that the wealth of knowledge is actually most of the time in the chat. So it's one of the reasons I love to have open chats, because we can have these conversations based on our experiences, and we can hear from everyone, where they are and what kinds of similarities or differences exist in their application of the knowledge and the ideas. This goes back for me, the cognitive science research goes back almost 20 years when I had started doing some of my first investigations in the space. And it was one of the interesting things for me is that my first investigations were not so much into the psychology or the psychology of e-learning or even the psychology of learners. They were into the sort of field in general of cognitive science, which was for me pretty heavily rooted in the work that was being done in games and artificial intelligence. And so it fascinates me to see how over the years there have been parallels in those spaces. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
I just vamped for you while you were out.
I figured you would be able to manage that.
And I was also thanking the folks in chat, because they really have been contributing an interesting series of comments into the chat that align to that. And then while you were out, I also mentioned that some of my earliest exposure here was in the area of cognitive science as it relates to games, game theory, artificial intelligence, and so on. And there do seem to be a lot of parallels.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, for sure. And talking about when we were here talking about the personalized learning, and I mentioned the second prong of that, the idea of the material being available at a time and a venue and a medium that makes the most sense. So one of the things that we did, and this gets into the technology piece, and you'll see some of these elements that you were talking about on here. We broke down respondents into two groups. We asked them a question: your current approach to learning, whatever it may be, is it having a strong positive impact on specific business outcomes like employee engagement, individual performance, voluntary turnover, time to productivity? And we took the organizations that said, yes, our approach is having a strong positive impact. Those would be your high index, orange. And then the blue are the organizations that said, no, we're not having that kind of an impact. And said, okay, so now let's see if those organizations are doing anything differently, thinking anything differently from each other. And we found, like, in a striking difference in what they do from, say, a modality or tools perspective, right? So we asked, do you use these different tools within your learning programs? And 79% of these high impact organizations say they use video often or always in their programs. They use coaching and mentoring opportunities. You can see the informal peer-to-peer, and you just see the gaps between the two about using these kinds of opportunities frequently. This isn't to say that those low impact companies aren't doing it at all. They just don't seem to do it very often. And so there's a bit of a correlation between companies that are having that kind of an impact and the fact that they use a wider variety of interactions when they're working with their learners. And so you can see, things that were mentioned even in chat, right? More social collaborative elements, 44% versus 12%, more micro learning. So getting learning, be able to fit into these sort of spaces that people may have, all these elements. The coaching and mentoring one to me is amazing. I think that companies are looking for more and more opportunities to do this, and that it's starting to be thought of through a technology lens, which is not something that had been in the past. It's always been sort of because of the nature of what it is, it's a sort of one-on-one, it's part of the performance process, the performance management process. But really, coaching and mentoring interactions are very much learning experiences. And if we could find and leverage tools that allow us to scale those kinds of interactions so that people aren't wasting time on interactions that aren't necessary or aren't meaningful. So you can eliminate all the sort of preliminary stuff so that when those interactions occur, they are fully meaningful. It's easier to match people with the right mentors and coaches if you have the technology. And it's easier to scale and deliver that, because I think companies find how really impactful coaching really is. And that goes for not just specific coaches or like people who are named, but I think it's the entire sort of manager team relationship as well. I think companies are really rethinking the manager's role in this whole learning ecosystem, and that it's a very, very important one that has been often overlooked.
Yeah, I think you couldn't be more right on that one. And I definitely seen the technology companies starting to step up their game in terms of providing technologies to support coaching and mentoring efforts. I'll be
Mhm.
really excited when I see that come together with methodologies for helping those coaches and mentors do so more effectively, right? I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. What are technology companies doing? Well, for the most part, they're providing technology to pair up people based on their perception of their like or shared skills and interest pool. And the one thing that's kind of absent there is it reminds me of my early years of being a professor, right? I was always mystified when I sort of rolled out of the work I had been doing, which was all live theater stuff, into teaching. And I was sort of dumbfounded. Wait a minute, you mean teachers don't know anything about teaching? We all just assumed, I mean, like I think that was true for a lot of college professors that you were sort of an expert in your field, and isn't that enough? And I learned the hard way through a very bumpy road that no, you're not inherently a good teacher because you know the topic. In fact,
Mhm.
my experience tells me that the better you know a topic, probably the worse you are at teaching that topic.
Yeah, I mean, how many people on the call have similar experiences where it's the same thing we see with the manager position, supervisor, where somebody has just become so good at their particular job, and there's no room,
They
right?
just grunt.
So now you're a manager, and now you supervise a group of people who do what you do. They may have zero management skills, but like, what else
Right.
do we do? And so it's the same thing with learning. Look, I mean, if you see behind me, there are drums behind me. I'm a
Yeah.
relatively proficient drummer, and in the past, I've tried to give lessons. I'm not very good at that. I don't know how to tell somebody how to do that. They'll sit there and I say, well, you just do it. It's the thing, and you just do it. So I know how that is. So it's one thing to be a subject matter expert, it's a
Yeah.
completely other thing to be.
But I mean, it's a perfect field for us to get into in terms of technology support and overall support, right? Because if we could provide sort of built-in coaching and mentoring lessons that are fairly universal, I mean, the approach of helping an SME kind of dumb down or simplify their world into baby steps is kind of at the core of helping them
Mhm.
mentor or train somebody new through. And sometimes it's as simple as that, just helping them understand, hey, you know, let's not take anything for granted. Let's, just as Sabrina is saying, let's do it one step at a time. What do they need to know first? What did you learn about second? What do you regret not knowing at that point? And that kind of thing. And so guiding people through those steps can really help them become a better mentor. And then the flip side of that also is non-technological, right? It's like, does the organization value it, right? So
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
great stuff.
Yep. And so along similar lines, now not specific to technology, but more around the learning experience itself, is similar breakdown, right? Those high impact companies versus those low impact companies. The high impact companies are much more likely to provide methods to reinforce the learning concepts, right? What we were just talking about, and also opportunities to practice and apply the knowledge, which is so critical. I mean, you
Yeah.
just can't overstate the importance of this, and we see it time and time again, especially when you start to think about skills that could be counterproductive if we allow people to sort of just try it on the fly in the real world, whether that's customer conversations. Do you want someone's first challenging customer conversation to be a real one? Maybe people should be able to practice these skills, and that's really how we learn before we get out there. And there's a couple actually other things that were in this particular question that I didn't have on this because we weren't talking about it, but there was something that came in the chat that Gretchen mentioned about connecting with IT is so important because you need to be able to continue to improve enterprise search and surface learning content in a much easier way.
Yeah.
One of the things that would have been in this list that's in the data is these high impact companies are far more likely to provide better opportunities to search and discover learning materials. So creating that
Right.
sort of that consumer like experience that people have become very accustomed to in the rest of their life For some reason they get to work and nothing works that way anymore. But that's what they want. They want to know, oh, this is of interest to me. Oh, I didn't even know that existed, but it makes sense for me, and being able to explore and discover things like that. And that goes all into the entire personalization conversation as well.
So critical. Bevan, by the way, in the chat says a strong belief in being an expert is to make that a passion that derives the best out of you, which benefits self and the organization as a whole. And I think it's that last part, Bevan, that really resonates for me, that oftentimes people aren't so much thinking about the whole, they're only thinking about themselves when they think about their expertise. And it's definitely a great way to see it, as your expertise is not just about you, it's about your ability to share that expertise with other people.
Oh yeah. And Robert's actually made a point here too about the learning curve for managers, right? Being able why they do something and the way they do it, and then help others understand. And I love that you put this in here, Robert, is that our job as learning professionals is to help them transmit that information. And I think that's such a key point to that relationship that the manager has in the learning experience. And that's the other side of it. So there's the one side is, hey, if we want learning to be more relevant to the job, if we want people to be able to practice, if we want it to fit into the flow of work, managers are the ones that understand those things. They know what people are doing day to day. They know what practice should look like because they know what good should look like. They're the ones that need to be critiquing that. So they need to be involved in that process. But on the flip side of that, using the manager as a source, as a subject matter expert, as a source of knowledge, but helping them to transmit that knowledge, because that's what we were just talking about. They may be a subject matter expert. They may be the best at that particular thing, but it's a learning professional's job to translate that into the things that help people understand and learn and grow from that. So I think that's a great point to make. Thank you. We touched on a few things around learning technology. I think I just want to share this because I think it's I usually hear a sigh of relief if you do this in a room full of live people, because 45% of companies say that their learning technology ecosystem is inadequate to meet their needs, and so that's pretty large. And then you've got 40%, okay, it meets our needs, but that's less than half, and then 15% saying, okay, well, it's actually above and beyond. So there's a lot of room for improvement here, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to throw everything in the wastebasket and start over and look for a bunch of different stuff. It's really about assessing what is our technology ecosystem, what do we have available to us, how does it all work together? Are there things that we're not doing that we could be, right? Is there things that we have that we could be leveraging? Maybe there's things in a particular application or platform that we're not even aware of. Maybe we need to go back to the provider and have a consultation, say, hey, here's our use cases, here are our challenges. Can you help us with that before you start that process of, okay, now we know where we're lacking. We know where the problems are. Let's try to fill that with something new or something different.
Yeah. Gretchen mentions that it would be great if learning systems could be more easily helpful to managers and the like. Gretchen, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, it was one of the things as we first kicked off the design of the learning systems that we were creating at Adobe, we were kind of confused. We looked around and said, why are people pushing all the information about enrollments, et cetera, up to the admin level? Why doesn't this manager, why doesn't this person who's working with this person every day, why don't they have access to courses, to content, to looking at, how their performance has been across their learning experiences and so on? And so we kind of redesigned it to add that midpoint manager or program facilitator as someone who had visibility into the work that their team was doing. And I think there's plenty of room for this to go even further, that it just makes sense that the person who's closer to you, think about some of these organizations. We've worked with organizations that have million plus employees. How on earth is somebody in an administrative capacity going to be of any benefit to the average person, when there are a million people down line from that administrator, or in a better case, maybe 10,000. That's still way too many. It should be their division leader, their unit leader, their immediate manager who has some visibility there, who can help, give them some guidance and direction.
And that kind of insight is so important because, we're not dismissing the role of the admin by any means. It's a very role. But I think the idea of, if you see a bunch of, say, let's just make it very simplistic, a bunch of red flags, right? You've got a thing where you've got green, yellow, red, and you see a bunch of red. To an admin, that means, okay, I need to email these people automatically or whatever it is to get them to do it. But if a manager can see that, that isn't just about, oh, these people didn't finish this program or they haven't. That means my team might not be able to do this thing I need them to do, right?
Right.
The things that the business is trying to move forward, that might not happen because people haven't figured out how they're supposed to do it yet. And so that kind of insight is far more valuable and important. So it's important that the both groups have it and they work together
Yeah.
where an admin
Oh
can
yeah.
point the manager in the right position in the right place and help them take steps to mediate anything that's going on like that.
Mhm.
So this is just a sense, give people again a sense of what's going on from a learning environment standpoint. We asked, how often does your organization leverage these in your learning programs? This is on a scale from 1 to 5, so you've got the weighted average number here. But not surprisingly, e-learning modules, number 1, virtual classrooms, number 2, in-person instructor-led classrooms still hanging on there at the top, which is fascinating. Because obviously, when I asked this question in 2019, ILT was at the top, and it was a massive gap between ILT and everything else. So this has just sort of been a realignment of our reality. But the fact of the matter is, and rightly so, ILT is still up there at the top. I think it's going to always be an important piece of the learning experience. I just hope that we do it differently now that we've had this time to reflect on what life is like without it.
Right.
And so, but it just gives you a sense of all the different things that are being used. And, you even
Well,
get down to simulations of games. Yeah, they're maybe low on the numbers list, but it's obviously games are not something you're going to use all the time for everything. So,
well, and David, I wonder what your thoughts are about, and I know I'm pushing the time boundaries here, but on the ILT side, we sort of crashed into it with the pandemic and ended up a lot of people adopting virtual instructor-led experiences that were really more designed for one-on-one chat or at best group chat, but that aren't, full of tools and services solutions for polling, monitoring, administering, even handling, uh, large groups, monitoring data coming in, censoring inappropriate messages, just like there's a host of different things, including having interactive learning experiences inside of a virtual classroom space that didn't so much get adopted because there was this sort of rush to let's use the most common or the most popular video stream tools. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you see that
yeah,
evolving or changing?
I think it'll evolve. It's a real true challenge because it isn't just, you're right. There was a bit of a quick short-term vision default. Let's just do what's available to us. But there is a real challenge with, there's so much that happens virtually now, and people spend a lot of time in virtual meetings. If we turn learning into yet another virtual meeting, it starts to lose its meaning and it starts to
Yes.
lose its impact and effectiveness. And people are just like, I don't want another one. And so there's this balance of, hey, we need to use the tools that people already have, people are comfortable with, give them familiar layouts and interactions. So let's leverage what we have, Teams, Zoom, because they're already using it. But at the other end of that is, how are we making the learning experience more meaningful? So there are tools that can layer the kinds of things that you're talking about on top of these familiar places
Right.
that we're in.
Yeah.
So you can take something like this, Zoom, and layer on a lot of those classroom capabilities on top of it. And I think that's where things will start to go. And then I think over time, Zoom fatigue will sort of fall away. People become more accustomed, and we can then ask, okay, yes, we do all of our meetings in this tool. We'd like to do the classrooms in this more robust tool, and people will be more comfortable switching from one to the other. I think right now there's this panic of, I can't ask people to log into 7 different things during
Right.
the day. But again, that also fights against the fatigue of constantly being in these little windows all the time. So
Yeah.
it's a big
Uh,
challenge.
Catherine points in the chat to gamification being low on the space, and I think the same thing is true of social and collaborative learning, and then that's been that way for years and years and years. Any thoughts about that? Are these things really the next big thing because of their immersion and engagement factors, or are are they just the
Yeah.
thing that was always supposed to happen but never did? Where are we, do you think, there?
I never really thought of them as the next big thing. I just thought of them as the next interesting thing, an effective thing, and they have a very specific use case. And it really depends on how you use them. So I don't think they're ever going to climb a list like this where they're going to be used all the time for everything,
Right.
especially because if you're talking specifically about games, and I know that we can get into spend a whole other hour talking about the power of an actual game of, learning how to problem solve, learning how to work together, how to meet a challenge. I think it's very effective, but it's a very specific use case. I think what you see more of is gamification. So you take the
Right.
things that people are already doing, the things they should be learning, and adding these gamification elements to sort of boost adoption, boost engagement, boost that reward feeling that people deserve when they accomplish something. So trying to take those elements, whether it's points, badges, some kind of reward, some kind of leveling, but building in these gamification elements around, because most of our life is already gamified, whether we know it or not. We're acquiring points at the grocery store, where people are on the Peloton and they're competing against someone halfway around the world. There's a million things that we do every day that have a gamified element to them that we either are aware of or not, that we enjoy, that make that experience a little bit richer for some reason. So we're seeing that get applied to learning. So there is this distinct difference between, I'm going to put you in a game where you participate and do these things, whether it's a full-on video game with an avatar or a simple word game, matching, those kind of things, as long as they're used for a specific purpose and they match the needs of the content. And then there's the gamification of the learning. So I think they'll both continue to grow, but I don't see a place where games would be fourth on this list for any reason. All right, so just a couple more data points, and I think we're doing a great job of talking and getting any questions, so keep those in. I think we're fine on time, and just trying to give a sense of what lays ahead, what technologies will be important to address the future of work requirements. And, I think it's important to see that LMS is second on here. So you think, oh, future, right? I hear the word future. Why am I seeing LMS? Because in order to get things done and do what we want to do, it makes sense that an LMS would still be sort of the centerpiece of a lot of the learning environments that are out there, and especially a lot of the modern LMS and what it does and what it's for. But going back to my earlier point about coaching and mentoring being number one. And that is, again, you typically have not heard of that in a technology conversation. Yep. And now, what technology do you want? I need coaching and mentoring technologies. And that's the number one thing. I think that's the most interesting thing for me on here. You see things like badging, gaming on here. I mean, 42% of organizations are saying it's going to be important. Augmented reality, even virtual reality, which, we've been hearing about virtual reality since the 80s, but I think this really come together where equipment costs, bandwidth, processing power have all come together to make it feasible. And also the practical applications of it. It's no longer just, I want to put my learner on the moon for this particular thing. It's actually, no, I can immerse you in an experience that you may have at work, whether that's ultra dangerous and that's why I'm immersing you, or it's just requires role play with a bunch of different people that I don't have available to me. Those kind of things.
Definitely, that's the big takeaway for me. Coaching and mentoring, top of every list. I mean, that should tell us something about a serious effort that's happening across the industry.
Mm-hmm. And then just the last bit on the integrations, we talked, sort of the theme of the webinar here is learning experience and the business. And so from a technology standpoint, how is learning connected to the business? Because we've talked about how, from a strategy standpoint, from a what's in it for me standpoint, connecting all these things, making the learning connected to the business, the goals of the business. Okay, now from the nuts and bolts side, how is it connected to the business? And you see things like organizations know that they integrate with their HRIS, which makes sense. That's just the sort of system of record typically. But then a data analytics tool, 33%. Data has become very critical too. We see that on the top of a list of things that, like, skills that L&D teams want on their team. Data and analysis skills. What do they want from their learning technology? They want better reporting and analytics. So there's a real need for data and analytics as more things become driven by AI and machine learning. That's fuel. Data is its fuel. So we need to be able to collate data from around the organization, and that's puts a lot of pressure on the organization to come up with a data strategy, right? So the learning group may have a strong data strategy. We know what all the data is, where it is. But does that line up with finance or operations? Do you talk about data in the same way? Can you bring data from one place and line it up with
Right.
data from somewhere else. And that's what's really important, because there are all these systems, and obviously many more than on this list for any given organization, where those connections need to happen.
I mean, the more integration we see with these systems, I think that the better off we are in terms of proving our business case, right? I think, there's one that I don't even see on here, which we've done recently, which is integration with marketing and marketing intelligence tools. And I know that, as you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of others. I'm
Yeah.
speculating here, but I'm pretty sure that these numbers are on the rise. And it makes sense to me because if you think about what people want to do in terms of workforce management or in terms of talent, being able to take this data and bring it all together and learn from it is only going to help you drive home your business case. So that wherever you can combine the enterprise solutions, you can theoretically create new cases where you're helping people to accomplish their goals and making them more aware of the impact of those goals as they relate to one another. There's a plethora of opportunity here. I hope that we just continue to see this rise with more use cases.
We will. And, you start to throw in the extended enterprise into this mix. And then a lot of organizations are training customers, they're training resellers or partners or franchisees. And so now you're actually opening up integrations with other parts of the business and more systems, because you're reaching these audiences that typically weren't, they weren't thought of as learners because they are customers, but there's a whole ecosystem around them that you need to integrate with as well. So yeah, we have different research practices here, right? So we've got performance management, you've got talent, and if you talk to any one of the other analysts who head up those, they've got all of their technology solution lists and things, and so you start to pull it all together, and there's just so much technology going on, and the thing that keeps them all together, aside from a cracking IT department, is data. And that's really the language. And Sabrina, and I see that Gretchen seconded your thought here, that democratization of data is important to drive the business in a holistic way. And it's true, because we have seen that I said that L&D teams, the number one skill they want for their team is data and analytics. They may not get it. And so the challenge is, what do I have available to me? Can I lean on someone else in the organization that has data scientist background or data analysis background? Or do I have someone on my team who hits a certain level? So now can I find tools that match that, so that person, even if they're not a data scientist, can ask questions and get answers from the data? So that idea of the democratization of data is critical, so that almost anybody, and it doesn't have to be anybody, but almost anybody can answer these questions that the business has using data. Is very, very important, and it all comes with integration. So I'm just going to throw up the takeaways here. I don't necessarily think I have to read through all of them. We'll leave them here, but just we've kind of talked about all these things about figuring out where skills we have, what skills we may need, how do we address those gaps, how do we address gaps that may appear that we are not aware of yet, which is fine, but just figuring out how to do it, working with the business to understand what it is the business leaders need. Hey, what do your people need to be better, faster, stronger as we move forward? And then as a learning professional, I can help translate that into learning experiences that will hopefully deliver those outcomes. One other thing here, number 4, I think is important, the idea just becoming familiar with these technologies. I mentioned when we were talking about cognitive science, it's not that you need to become a neuroscientist, but to become aware of what these things mean to learning. Similarly with technology, you can't just dismiss things out of hand. Get a basic understanding of what AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning are, what the difference is between artificial intelligence and machine learning is. Because what happens is technology providers will come to you with this stuff and say, yeah, we have that. Well, what does that mean? What does it do? How does it help me? And if you don't understand what the technology does, at least on a surface level, you can't then evaluate that. And we even saw in a recent study, we asked, hey, do you think the metaverse is going to have an impact on learning in the future? And 80% of companies said it's going to have at least some kind of impact on how we do things. I thought was fascinating to me, because I'm still sort of a skeptic on that I think that the metaverse is going to be really a thing. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe a year from now, we'll be all in our headsets having this meeting talking about how wrong I was. But it's interesting that 80% of companies are still, okay, it's on my radar, and it's important. Understand what it is, what it means, so that when it does maybe eventually have an impact, you're ready.
So, David, we have a couple of questions
Yep.
that snuck past us in the Q&A pod.
Sure.
The first one has to do with the half-life of skills. Are there specific ways to measure the half-life of skills learned in trainings? Often we are seeing training being used as the cause of errors more than a year or two after the training has been complete. Yeah, I mean, my answer to that is that if you look at that, I forget who Brown worked with. Was it Brown and I forget the partner, but if you read the articles on Half-Life of Skill from Brown, I believe that there's a specific methodology proposed that has something to do with either 50 or 60% of the information that was learned is no longer accurate or has inaccuracies or something like that. But that number for measurement always seemed wrong to me. So I think you would have to set your own gate. And one of the problems that we sort of looked at a while back, I think we did an article on it, was, is there a perfect way to determine this across different disciplines? Because in the end, what are you going to do? So you're an L&D kind of administrator. What you probably want to do is tag courses and say this course probably has an expected half-life of 18 months or or 24 months or whatever the period is that you think for that industry becomes dangerous, and then be able to practice good hygiene on it. And then you'd have to, on top of that, say, well, it's also possible that it might go belly up before that point. David, do you have any kind of specifics around half-life of skills?
No, I think you're pointing in the right direction for the experts on that. I think part of the question, if I recall it, because I can't see it anymore, but it was something about years down the road, if those skills weren't where
They're
they
no
should
longer
be,
right. Yeah.
they blamed the training from 2 years ago. So I
Yeah.
think in that scenario, then there's actually something else at work where maybe we should be revisiting on a more frequent basis.
Right.
There should be maybe an ongoing performance conversation about those skills so that it isn't 2 years later when we say, oh, that training you took, apparently it
Right.
failed because you don't know how to do this now. Well, the whole world has changed in those 2 years, and maybe that particular skill doesn't apply the way it used to. So it's about, I think, more frequent check-ins. Yeah.
Oh, I was
Sorry,
just going to say it applies.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. So it applies to this notion we've been playing with, which is we think of as actionable data. I think in future, what we need to demand from these systems is that they look at things like patterns of responses in interactions and quizzes. And if over a period of time, those patterns of responses seem to be indicating that more and more consistently the answer is incorrect to an assessment, that mechanism can be used in part to make that evaluation. But when we talk about that as it relates to a training, the training is inherently flawed. So the responses are going to be correct but incorrect, or where are they getting that new corrected information? It's more about mistakes on the job. I'm sorry. Go ahead, David. Your thought.
That's fine. It's just amazing how if when things go well, people say, well, there are too many variables. We can't say that training had an impact. But as soon as something goes wrong, training is the direct.
There was definitely training.
Yeah. So that's a cultural issue.
There was a question about, can we define space learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, and I don't want to be too remedial about it, but it is sort of what it is. It's the idea of just taking bits and pieces of it, spreading it out over time, giving people a chance to absorb, reflect, time away, come back. You can't front load everybody with everything they're going to need all at once and expect them to remember it and use it. So it's just providing a cadence that makes sense to come back and visit things as their real life happens throughout. I don't know if you have a different take on it, Alan.
No. And the last question, David, is one you will remember from when we talked about this a couple of weeks back. Can you give an example of adaptive learning technology from slide 22? That one stuck in my craw too. I was like, I'm not sure I know what they mean by adaptive learning.
And so it's relatively specific, and there are a few tools out there that'll use that terminology. There are others that do the thing that I'm about to explain, but maybe don't call it that. The idea is that based on how I progress through the learning, based on my performance within the learning, so my ability to answer questions not only correctly but confidently, right? So you're judging two things. Yeah. You will get remediation when necessary and acceleration when appropriate, so that you can have 1,000 people take part in this program, and each one will have a somewhat different experience through the program. based on how they're progressing, how they're performing, how they react to things. If they're whatever the interaction is, if they're challenged by something, if they're stuck, if they rewatch certain things, the system is able to take all that information and go, okay, this person's struggling here. I need to point them in this direction, bring them back to here. Or even we're stuck. I've done everything mechanically that I can do. I'm going to alert a manager or supervisor or somebody that this person needs a coaching intervention, something like that, where it as you go through, it's reacting to your ability. And that what it does is it prevents people, like it takes into account people's previous experience and knowledge, which a lot of learning tends not to do. So how many times have people been in learning like, well, I know this already, I already had this job, I know all this stuff. So do we take that into account so they're not getting that, so it's not repetitive? Are we making sure they're not getting stuff that's completely irrelevant to what they do and what they need? And then is the system shifting what people are getting based on how they interact?
Cool.
Let's see here. We're a little over, but I'm going to stay. I don't mind staying and make sure we answer questions. But integrated learning experience and its importance. Can we help? And how do we create the awareness and importance? And the question went away.
Oh no! Did I do that? Oh, I'm so
maybe.
sorry. Look under answered. Look under the middle
Oh,
tab.
okay. Oh, you were writing an answer. Okay. Thank you.
I didn't mean to make it vanish for you. No.
Yeah. Well, how do we create awareness and the importance of such learnings to our audience and our management? Yeah, you're right, Alan, about good to go on another session, but it really is about, if you have the relationships with the business leaders that we've been talking about, this ability to say, what is it that the business needs to be better? That relationship is going to help you with that awareness, because now the business leaders can say, hey, this initiative that we have and these things that we want you to do, we're creating a whole set of tools that are going to help you do that. And all of a sudden now there's awareness, and it's coming from that sort of authoritative voice. No offense to all the learning leaders and professionals on the line. You may not be the authoritative voice on these things in the business, but when their leadership starts to tell them, hey, this is what we're going to give to you, here's what we're going to provide to you, here's what it's going to look like, then that awareness becomes much greater. That's my quick take on that one.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So I appreciate everyone. Wow, great conversation going on and people talking to each other in the chat. That was great. I think we managed to answer everybody's questions as they were coming. So Alan, I really appreciate you staying on top of that. And of course, just, bringing your knowledge and understanding to all these things. It's been exciting for me. I love talking to you, and I'm just happy to invite people into our conversation. Hopefully people felt as though they were included and we got some questions answered.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Melissa. Thanks to the Adobe team and everybody who participated today. Thanks all.